So I want brothers to kind of think about this, especially when it comes to traveling and meeting foreign women, and also for any you know critics out there that kind of assume that a lot of these women are poor, impoverished, um, desperate, or needy. This is something that a lot of people need to pay attention to. And so I want to get a couple more people tuned in because I don't want them to kind of miss this, miss what I'm about to say. Let me know who out there if you can. I don't know if you guys are at work, on the way to work, or just waking up, but it's all good. So a little bit of background. So I was remembering situations where I used to, be prepared to visit certain women in particular countries, whether it was Brazil, DR, or even Colombia. And, in the back of your mind, you know, you want to, you assume that they're looking for help or they may need help because of their situation. And so it was a couple instances where, maybe they took what I said out of context, but, I pretty much, kind of implied that, if they need anything, I'll look out for them, um, but I was interested in meeting them and, spending time with them while I was out there. And some immediately took it as like, I'm not a prostitute and stuff like that. And I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, I didn't assume you were. And, I didn't really think I was coming at you like that, you know? So it just kind of made me think about, hmm, well, one, what made them, what did I say to make them think that was coming at them or assuming that they was a prostitute? And then two, why are they not impressed with the money that I could, that I could offer? In the chat, Charles Jones, good morning. Ace Diamond, good morning. For me, I'm currently working in London, but I'm still tuning in. Okay, appreciate it. Shout out to London. So I want to put into context what's going on. So I have a cousin. I have a cousin, right? And all he used to date was all he dated is white women. All he dated is white women. And we know that black people are pretty much at the bottom of the totem pole economically, right? So with that, as black people, we know we know who's really poor or who's got some in the black community because we're familiar with each other. But I started to realize, but in the white community, for example, by them always in the news hearing bad things about black people, white people kind of associate us, with being poor class. So their mindset, from a macro standpoint, is that black people are, they got it bad. A lot of white people feel sorry for blacks in the in the U.S. So I remember my cousin, and any guys that you might have friends or family that may attest to this as well. But my cousin, he used to, he always get taken care of by white women, and my cousin, he wasn't a person that had like a lot of money, but but he did what he had to do to just kind of survive and get by, and so he wasn't like poor or impoverished or anything like that. But he had a lot, pretty much, white women when they went out to eat, the white women offered to pay. They didn't really have any expectations of them. And and I started to think about that because a lot of white women, they don't really, they don't dig in their pockets for white men like that. You know, I don't even think they probably would for Asian men. They're probably, the assumption is those men got it. So that's pretty much the assumption. Like, when he was dating these white women, they assumed that he didn't have it. So, this is an interesting thing, and I'm gonna explain why. John Thomas said, "Good morning." Charles Jones said, "Fun fact: a lot of those pros have real legit 9 to 5s and do something on the side." Yeah, that's a good point as well. That's a great point. So the white girls used to, a lot of brothers they take care of. They pay, they pay if you go out to drink, go out to eat, help out with money, and it's because they assume that we are poor. Fair, what up? What up? They assume that we are poor, and it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad assumption. It's just that black people, white people understand the history, the mistreatment, and you can't blame them for a lot of them just thinking we're all in a bad situation. Unless a white woman meets you in like a professional setting, for the most part, what I mean, she might feel like she gotta help out. So the same thing applies. Salute, K. Halton. Same thing applies if you with the foreign women. A lot of us have this perception that, man, Brazil, Colombia, DR, is poor. The economy, our dollar is strong. So we have an assumption that, people, I used to have an assumption that people didn't have, food to eat sometimes. They was just struggling to make it. And so a lot of people, a lot of foreign women, men too, they take advantage of. Well, I mean, they recognize that, and they take a. I don't want to say they take advantage of it, but they just let us be dumb, and so we treat, take care of people that, what I mean, that got it themselves, that could pay for it themselves, for the most part, you know, and a lot of times, you know, some people may you're gonna run into people that may be offended by you offering to pay something. It's just like if I was in the US and I was with a white girl and she just, made me feel like she had to pay because I was broke, because I'm black, I would probably feel a little offended, depending on how she offered, you know, like, don't worry about it, I understand if you can't really afford it. I'll probably feel like, damn, you know what I mean? Like, I'm good. I went to college. I got a good paying job. Like, you don't have to pay. So some women, and probably more in Brazil because they have a little bit more. They're a little bit more advanced, socially, economically. So I noticed that in a lot in Brazil, women will, say, you don't have to pay, or I got it, or kind of be offended if you offer, because they may feel like you're coming at them like a prostitute. So I was just, so it made me think, like, what, all these women are not, all these people are not broke and and poor. In respects to the US, yeah, they don't make enough money, um maybe to buy flights and go on vacation, but at the same time, a lot of black people in the US don't have a lot of money to buy flights and go on vacation too. So in respect to each country's in respects to each country respective economies, you know the poor, well, I say the have and the have nots is about the same. Most people, and I'm just speaking of black people in the United States. Most black people in the United States, got food to eat, got their basic needs met. They may not have money to go out all the time or to get their hair cut or get their hair done, but for the most part, basic needs. We damn near got more homeless people on the street than I've been seeing in some of these countries. So when we approach travel and people that's ignorant about travel, you have to understand that poor is relative. This is we don't live in a times where they used to have images of poor Africans in Africa, you know, playing in dirt, living in huts, and looking anorexic because they don't have no meat on their bone. We're not at that point. I mean, now I heard places like Cuba and Haiti. That's a different in Ethiopia, for example. Now those places, you know, um, you'll make a big difference. you know. But like Colombia, DR, Brazil, especially those places that has a lot of family support, they they got it. They got basic needs. So a lot of times, like my man's was saying, is that the money that they probably want, or women that may want some things, are usually gold diggers, and they usually want money for materialistic things. There's not usually money, to survive for the most part. So no, all these foreign chicks, most of them are not uh poor. They can get by day to day. Yes, everybody needs help once in a while, but they can get by day to day. So especially if you're traveling to Brazil, and approach women and you want to, show them appreciation and be nice. You have to not really be so forward to offer something. What I mean? They will tell you. They will tell you, say, hey, especially if they traveling. Hey, I'm looking forward to meeting you. I know there may be expenses. Let me know if you need help with anything, um, and keep it like that. And most of the time, they'll help. A lot of these countries, especially Latin countries, they have a lot of pride. I noticed that in Colombia. Men, guys that maybe help with information or been very helpful. Sometimes you may offer, men, like, man, let me buy you lunch or something like that. A lot of them would be like, no, no, that's okay, or I got it. Now Dominican men a little different. I done seen them. The Dominican men tend to be a little different. They ain't, they ain't gonna turn down a handout. But I've seen it, in Colombia. I've seen, the men, they'll turn down a handout. You know, So a lot of them got pride too. You know, so yeah, foreign women, they are not all poor or broke, and just like Black Americans, we're not all poor and broke. It's just that perception that's had, and like I said in the beginning, white women, they assume a lot of Black men are poor or broke, and so they offer more. And they don't have a problem offering because they know you're not taking advantage of them because they got it and they feel like you don't. And the same things apply to overseas. We feel like we don't feel like they're taking advantage of us like we might feel like American women might be taking advantage of us. So we don't mind paying because we think they're either poor or broke. Said Brazilian women are the same. They have a degree of pride, though some will beg. True, true, true. Very, 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 very true. But yeah, I just wanted to put this on y'all mind, man. I was thinking about it, and I was like, damn, man. You know, um, damn. You know, uh, in the U.S., a lot of people do think we are poor and broke, and a lot of times we get We get handouts because of that. Now we still are at the bottom of the totem pole, respectively. So that don't mean that people people need to stop, looking out for black people in general. But at the same time, we're not as even though we're at the bottom of the totem pole economically, we're still, we still can get by. We still are getting by, day to day for the most part. He said Argentina women don't beg at all. Yeah, man, that's why. And I'm gonna close with this. This is why I've been making commentary in regards to Brazil, the last week, more than probably other countries. And this is why I want brothers to be prepared when they go to Brazil for the first time or looking for love. I got reminded so many times the beautiful women, casual sex culture is great. Pay for play is, great if you into that in Brazil. But those women don't need you. They don't need you. They don't need you, brother. you know. And that is for guys that want to feel that like they're needed. Brazil is going to be a rude awakening. You know what I mean? So a lot of times guys resort to pay for play because the normal women, you get teased because you feel like, man, I should have that. You thought you could have that easily, and it's not as easy. So that's all I got, man, for this morning rant. I'm out.